October 2025 saw a huge moment in America. Millions of people went to the streets for massive protests. This movement was called No Kings. It was one of the biggest protest actions in modern American history. Organizers believed around 7 million people took part. There were more than 2,700 events across all 50 states. People also showed their support in cities around the world. This was the second large No Kings protest. It was the third big protest against President Donald Trump's government since he returned to the White House in January 2025. The country was facing many hard problems. The federal government had been shut down for 18 days. This was the third longest shutdown in U.S. history. Many thousands of government workers were not getting paid or had to work without money. Basic public services were almost breaking down. At the same time, immigration agents were doing aggressive raids in many cities across the nation. Also, National Guard soldiers were seen on the streets in important cities like Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. President Trump had ordered these soldiers to be there, even though some state and local leaders did not agree. In this serious situation, many people chose to protest. They came out from Times Square in New York to small towns everywhere. As a symbol of their fight, they wore yellow clothing. This color was inspired by democracy movements in places like Hong Kong and Ukraine. Protesters held signs that shared strong messages, such as "Nothing is more patriotic than protesting," and "No kings, no queens, no fascist USA." The very large number of protests showed that America was thinking deeply about big questions. These questions were about who has power, what democracy means, and how much power the president should really have. 2. The start of a movement. The No Kings movement had a clear message. Its name came from America's past. In 1776, the country was born to say no to kings and queens. People wanted to avoid having one person hold too much power. This idea was very important to American history. Protesters at places like Lexington Battle Green, where America's fight for freedom began, connected their actions to this old struggle. They felt that today the country was again facing a leader who acted too much like a king. Actor Robert De Niro even referred to President Donald Trump as King Donald I. More than 300 different groups worked together to organize the No Kings protests. These included large organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and Move On, along with many smaller local groups. This showed that many different people shared the same concerns. The big protests in October were not the first. The movement started earlier, with No Kings Day on June 14, 2025. This date was President Donald Trump's birthday and also when a military parade was held. That first protest saw over 5 million people march in about 2,100 places. These early events helped the movement learn how to organize peaceful protests and showed its strength. Organizers believed the October protests were very important. Ezra Levin from Indivisible said that strong, patriotic people are the biggest challenge to a leader acting like a dictator. Another spokesperson, Hunter Dunn, noted that more and more people were understanding that this was a long fight. The protests in October happened because of serious problems, like a long government shutdown, strict actions by immigration agents, and soldiers being sent to cities. Organizers felt it was time to speak out loudly before important budget talks and future elections in 2026. They wanted to build momentum and remind everyone of America's promise of no kings. 3. Protests everywhere. The No Kings protests took place everywhere. On October 18th and 19th, more than 2,700 events happened across the United States. This large number showed that many people supported the movement. Big cities had very big rallies. In Washington, D.C., over 100,000 people gathered. They met on the National Mall and walked to the Capitol building. New York City also saw huge crowds. Protesters filled Times Square and areas in all 5 parts of the city. In Chicago, tens of thousands of people met in Grant Park. Other major cities like Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Boston, Austin, Seattle, and Atlanta also had many people demonstrating. The protests were not just in large cities. People also protested in small towns across America. From places like Billings, Montana to Lexington, Massachusetts, and from suburban areas to rural communities, people came out. This proved that the No Kings movement reached many different parts of the country, not only the big urban centers. The wide reach of these protests showed that the message was important to people from all walks of life. The No Kings message also reached beyond the United States. People in other countries held demonstrations to show their support. There were protests in cities like Vancouver, Montreal, Berlin, London, Madrid, Barcelona, and Tokyo. These international gatherings showed that people around the world were paying attention and stood in solidarity with those protesting in America. It was very important that these many protests were mostly peaceful. Police and law enforcement agencies reported that very few problems occurred. Many large cities recorded no arrests during the demonstrations. The organizers of the No Kings movement worked hard to ensure everything remained calm and orderly. They trained thousands of volunteers in techniques to keep events peaceful and reminded all participants not to bring any weapons. This careful planning helped keep the focus on the movement's important message of resistance. 4. Why people protested. Many people felt angry for several reasons, and these feelings led them to protest. They were worried about the country's direction. One big reason was the government shutdown. It had lasted for 3 weeks, making it the 3rd longest shutdown in U.S. history. About 900,000 government workers did not get paid, and another 700,000 had to work without pay. Essential services that people depended on were also affected. For many, this shutdown was more than a money problem. It showed that the government was not working as it should. Amanda Nature, a former government employee, said that people did not vote for the government to shut down or for important services to be stopped. Another cause for anger was how immigration agents acted. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, carried out many aggressive raids in cities across the nation. Since President Donald Trump returned to office, raids had become much stronger. Many people had been sent out of the country. Rules stopping ICE raids at schools, hospitals, and places of worship were removed. Sometimes these operations even led to U.S. citizens being held along with immigrants without proper documents. In Chicago, federal agents used tear gas on crowds, which then led a judge to order them to wear body cameras. Many people thought these actions were too harsh and worried about fairness. The use of National Guard soldiers in major American cities also made people upset. President Donald Trump ordered soldiers to patrol the streets of Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Memphis, and Chicago. State and local officials often did not agree with sending soldiers to their cities. While the government said the soldiers were there to fight crime or protect federal buildings, critics believed it was too much power from the federal government. They thought it was meant to scare opponents. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker said that sending soldiers to Chicago was an unconstitutional invasion of his state. A veteran of the Iraq War, Sean Howard, protested, saying he fought for freedom abroad and now saw problems at home. Finally, a new Supreme Court ruling caused great concern. In July 2024, the court made a decision that gave presidents a lot of protection from criminal charges for things they did in office. This ruling gave presidents absolute protection for actions in their main powers. Critics worried this decision put the president above the law, like a king. Justice Sonia Sotomayor warned the ruling created a law-free zone around the president, allowing the president to act as a king above the law. This ruling was a strong reason why people joined the No Kings protests. They greatly feared too much power in one person's hands and believed it went against the country's basic idea of not having kings. 5. Two different views. The No Kings protests revealed deep divisions among American political leaders. Republicans and Democrats saw the events in very different ways, highlighting how polarized the country had become. Each side used the protests to criticize the other. Republican leaders strongly condemned the demonstrations. House Speaker Mike Johnson called them the Hate America Rally. He claimed various radical groups, including pro-Hamas faction and the Antifa supporters, were involved. Johnson and other Republicans suggested, without proof, that protesters were paid. They also accused Democrats of delaying budget talks because of the rallies. Texas Governor Greg Abbott labeled an Austin protest Antifa-linked. He deployed extra state police and National Guard, warning that chaos would not be tolerated. Some Republican officials even hinted the protests could lead to violence. President Donald Trump briefly said, "They say they're referring to me as a king. I'm not a king." His White House spokesperson dismissed the events with, "Who cares?" In contrast, Democratic leaders and activists fully supported the protests. They viewed them as important acts of patriotism and exercises of First Amendment rights. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and Independent Senator Bernie Sanders both attended rallies. Sanders called them a Love America rally, stating millions believed in the Constitution. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said protesting against an out-of-control administration is quintessentially American, comparing it to motherhood, baseball, and apple pie. Other prominent Democrats, like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, also showed support. They highlighted constitutional principles, with Jeffries contrasting the peaceful protests with the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack, calling the No Kings protests the essence of patriotism. This stark difference showed America's deep political divide. Republicans tried to paint the protesters as un-American and radical. Democrats, in turn, used Republican criticism to show they were fighting for core American values. The protests became a clear symbol of how two sides understood the same events completely differently, with little room for agreement. 6. Famous people speak. Many famous people from Hollywood also showed their support for the No Kings movement. Their voices helped more people learn about the protests and encouraged participation. Actor Robert De Niro made a video that many people watched online. In it, he spoke about America's history. He said that 250 years ago, Americans did not want a king, King George III. They fought a war for democracy and won their freedom. De Niro then said that today, President Donald Trump acts like a king. He called him King Donald I and claimed he wanted to take democracy away from the country. Other famous actors used social media. Mark Ruffalo posted messages about protests in cities like Minneapolis and Philadelphia. He wrote that "We the people have the power, and together they would win," adding that courage is contagious. Filmmaker Spike Lee shared images from New York protests. Jamie Lee Curtis posted photos of people protesting in Los Angeles. Comedian Jimmy Kimmel created a funny list of nicknames for President Trump that protesters could use, such as Orange Julius Caesar. Actress Jean Smart recorded a video saying the president seems to admire dictators. She reminded everyone that America began by fighting a king, so saying "No Kings" is very patriotic. Many other well-known people, like Glenn Close, Jane Fonda, John Legend, and Kerry Washington, also shared their support. This help from celebrities brought much more media attention to the No Kings protests. It also showed many Americans that opposing President Trump's policies was a valid position. 7. A history of protests. The No Kings movement is part of a long and important history of protests in America. Many times, ordinary people have stood up to ask for change, and their actions have shaped the country. These protests show that when enough people work together, they can make a big difference. One strong example is the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. During this time, African Americans and their supporters fought to end unfair laws and segregation. Segregation meant that black people were kept separate from white people in schools, buses, and public places. People like Martin Luther King Jr. led many nonviolent protests, marches, and speeches. A very famous event was the March on Washington in 1963, where over 250,000 people gathered. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech there. These powerful and peaceful efforts led to new laws that gave all people equal rights. These laws helped to end legal segregation across the country. This movement showed how mass gatherings can bring real change. Another key movement was the fight for women's right to vote. For many decades, women protested, marched, and asked for their voices to be heard. They believed women should have the same political rights as men, including the right to choose their leaders. This struggle was long and hard. Women faced much opposition, but they did not give up. In 1920, after much struggle and continued public action, the 19th Amendment was passed. This important law gave women across America the right to vote. This was a huge change that came from people protesting peacefully and persistently. America's history is full of such movements. There were protests that ended slavery, and groups that fought for better working conditions and fair wages for workers. Each of these movements faced big challenges. But by coming together, speaking out, and often using nonviolent methods, they made their governments listen. These historical events share a common message. Nonviolent protests can lead to big changes. They show that when people gather in large numbers, they can get the attention of leaders and the public. This public pressure can make the government act and change laws. When many people protest, it shows that an issue is very important to them. Some studies even suggest that when a certain small but important part of a country's population actively protests in a nonviolent way, political change is almost certain to happen. The No Kings movement follows this powerful tradition. Like the protests before it, it uses the power of many voices to push for new directions in the country. It is a modern example of Americans using their right to protest to protect what they believe in and shape their future. The long history of American protests teaches us that ordinary people have the power to create a better country when they unite and speak out. 8. What happens next? The No Kings protests showed many Americans want change. Millions of people walked together. They showed that ordinary people can stand up for their country's values. But what happens after such big events? The protests asked important questions about America's future and its democracy. One big question is about power. Does the president have too much power? People worried about the Supreme Court's ruling. It said presidents have special protection from being charged with crimes for things they do as president. This made some people fear that presidents could act like kings, above the law. Also, the government sent soldiers to American cities. This was new and made many people ask if it was right for a president to do this without states agreeing. These actions made people wonder if America's system of checks and balances was still strong enough. The protests also highlighted a clear choice for the country. Will the protests lead to real changes, or will the problems simply get worse? One path is that people continue to stay active. They can keep working, registering voters, and supporting leaders who want to fix the system. If many people keep working together, changes might happen. Laws could be made to stop presidents from having too much power. It could also make sure different parts of the government work together better. This path would mean fixing and strengthening America's democratic rules. Another path is that the energy from the protests might fade away. People might go back to their daily lives. If this happens, the problems could get worse. Some worry that if people stop paying attention, leaders might get even more power. This could make it harder for ordinary citizens to have a say in their government. The country could become more divided. The way the protests were seen, some people supporting them, and others calling them Hate America rallies, showed how divided the country already is. This division makes it hard to solve problems together. Democracy is not something that stays the same forever. It needs people to work on it all the time. It needs citizens to watch what their leaders are doing. It needs them to speak up when they see problems. The No Kings movement was a big way that millions of Americans showed they are watching. They believe in their country's founding ideas, that no one should be a king. They believe that power belongs to the people. The protesters showed that everyday people have power. They reminded everyone that America was built on the idea of freedom from kings. They want to protect the idea that laws are for everyone, not just for some. Whether this movement will lead to a better future depends on what happens next. It depends on how people, leaders, and different parts of the government act in the coming months and years. 7 million people marched. Many more watched and wondered. Will these protests be remembered as the moment America chose a new path? Or will the questions about its future remain unanswered? What do you think is the most important thing ordinary people can do to protect democracy?
Hey there! Just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really, really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.